This took place in 1989 when I was around 7 years old, living in a section of Denver called Edgewater. My parents always said that this was a dangerous place, but they never really acted in a way to make me suspicious. They had me walk to the elementary school that I attended, and I was friends with all the neighborhood kids in this particular apartment complex. Well, I had been until one odd day. One of the neighbor kids came out. He was around 10 or 11, when the rest of us were between 6 and 8 at the time. I was 7. He came out with a couple of cups of liquid while a lot of us were playing in this courtyard that all the front yards of the apartments would open up to face. I don't remember the conversation, but he was insistent that we drank from his cups, which he insisted were just sugar water. I had played with the kid before, so I felt that I could trust him, and no one told me that bad guys could be other kids, especially the ones that I played with. So I took one of the cups. I went to take a sip, but as soon as I brought the cup to my face, I knew there was something wrong. The cup had a very strong floral scent. I asked him what was in it, and he again insisted it was just sugar water. I brought it to my lips just to taste it, still not trusting it. It was very bitter, and the floral scent was stronger. It turned out the kid had mixed air freshener in with water and tried to get us all to drink it. I gave the cup back to him and went into where I lived to tell my parents about the weird thing that had just happened. They confronted his mother, who really didn't seem to give a crap, but called the kid out to appease my parents. He had admitted what he had done in his justification. Well, air freshener is mostly just orange juice anyway. My parents and I moved out of that area of town and into a much nicer one, though more lonely as there weren't other kids around to play with. But I got to live in a creepy house by a creepy abandoned church at that point that still played bells on Sundays, so it all worked out. We were 16, an age where you feel invincible. It was summer and school was out, and my friend and I, who lived in the same apartment complex, decided to go to the mall and kill time as any other underage teenager would do. I don't remember much about that day other than our walk home from the mall. It must have been around 9 when we left, since that is the time the mall closes. Our apartment building was 2 miles away from the mall, so of course we walked. It was hot out, and we both knew that once we got home there would be nothing to do, so we opted to walk home. We enjoyed the conversation and the passing of time. Our town wasn't extremely dangerous. I mean, yeah, there were muggings and theft, but it wasn't as bad as other cities in our county, where unsolved murders were commonplace. So we walked those 2 miles oblivious to any potential threats. We were a mile in when we passed an intersection. Shortly thereafter, 3 males had walked out of the opposite street and began walking behind us. I didn't think much of it. It's summer, they were young, it's hot out. No reason to be suspicious. My friend, however, was unnerved. "Hey, yeah, those guys behind us, what about them? I'm pretty sure they're following us." "What? No, I don't think so, you're just being paranoid." As soon as I had said that, one of the men had started whistling at us. I turned around. "What you got in the bag?" And we had shopping bags from the mall. "Nothing, leave us alone," my friend retorted. I remember being upset. Why would she even respond to them? At this point, I was super nervous, and it turns out my friend was right. Call it intuition. We begin walking faster now that we sense danger, and as we quicken our pace, so do the men. They know that we're onto them. We near a plaza with a Del Taco, and as we enter the parking lot, the men disperse. One is directly behind us, and the other 2 are on our sides. I turn around. They all whip out freaking metal baseball bats out of nowhere. At this point, I turn to my friend and we hightail it to the Del Taco, not bothering to turn around. Thank God it wasn't too late, or they'd be closed and we would have nowhere to hide. As soon as we enter the Del Taco, we look out of the windows and witness all men jump into a Cadillac Escalade that was parked. Were they only trying to scare us? Why the baseball bats and why the car? What the heck is going on? We watch as the car drives away. That doesn't quell our fear. We spend about 10 minutes in the restaurant deciding what to do next. Do I call my dad to come pick us up, or do we walk the half-mile back home? We didn't want to worry our parents, and so, for some incomprehensible reason, we decided to walk. The whole time, we're constantly turning back, anticipating a black Escalade popping out of nowhere and kidnapping us. But it never did. As soon as we get home, we promise ourselves not to tell our parents, as it would hinder us from hanging out again. The moment that I walked through the door, I blabbed to my parents. I later found out that my friend did the same. The scariest experience of my young life. We grew up in a small, Midwestern factory town. Snowy, freezing winters and sweltering hot summers. My parents, my mom and stepdad, barely made ends meet. We moved from trailer home to cramped apartment multiple times over. When I was in 4th grade, my family finally had bought a house. Not just any house, but an enormous house. Only problem was that the home was split into a triplex, meaning 3 families could live there in separate quarters. Since we were still dirt poor, my parents of course had to rent out 2 of the 3. This meant that our family of 6 lived in a 2-bedroom shack section of the home. The second bedroom was really just a living room off the kitchen, which I shared with my sister and my youngest brother. The door to our home was in the kitchen. My dog Pepe was a natural-born protector. Pepe only weighed about 10 pounds, but he didn't let anything pass his sight without an alert. It's 3 a.m. on a 100-degree August night. 0 air conditioning, windows with too many holes in the screens to leave open. In the Midwest, that equals mosquitoes. The fans are running full blast throughout the space. I wake up to Pepe barking ferociously at the end of my bed. At first, I just stared at him and asked him to quiet down, figuring that he had heard a noise from one of the neighbors. But then I heard a shuffle from the kitchen. I turned left and started to try and focus past the bright light over the kitchen sink. And then I saw something move slightly, and upon meeting each other's gaze, they freeze. There were 2 men standing in the kitchen, and I'll never forget their faces to this day. We just stared at each other for what felt like minutes. Pepe didn't back down, but he also wasn't about to leave his post at the end of my bed. We had saved Pepe from a bad home earlier that year in the freezing winter, so he took his job pretty seriously. His bark was so loud I couldn't even think to scream. My mother suddenly flies out of the bedroom next to ours screaming at the 2 men. All I remember from her is screaming confrontation, and her chest swinging wildly in the bright glare from the kitchen light. The tallest man, at least 6'5" quietly looks at her and says, "Wrong house," connects eyes with me, and they both turn and exit, never to be seen again. My parents decided after that we should start locking our door at night. They justified the men by saying they were probably looking for the neighbors, and they didn't call the police. My mother is strong, independent, and hardworking. She worked her butt off as a sergeant in the army until she was honorably discharged, after she was taken advantage of by a fellow sergeant. They wanted to keep it hush-hush, which in my opinion was really messed up. She went on to work in a maximum security prison in Georgia, and this is where she met my father, who was also a corrections officer. When they had first met, they bonded over basketball. My mom was somewhat of a star when she was in high school, but a lot of college scouts overlooked her because of her height and color. He was able to go to college for it, until he hurt his knee and had to drop out and search for a different career. She says that everything was great. They were the it couple, a beautiful couple. She still says he was one of the most handsome men that she ever saw. She compares him to the singer Maxwell. He was smart, fit, charming, and funny. Life was perfect until he moved in with her a year into the relationship. and then everything went downhill. She says that some days she would come home from work to find him in a drunken stupor, lines of coke spread out on her own coffee table. They would argue, she would toss out his bottles of Jack, and he would smack her across the face. She would have no choice but to go into work the next day sore, with bruises on her face and black eyes. Her neighbors and coworkers knew what was going on, but they turned a blind eye. But the warden even threatened to fire her, saying that it wasn't good for the inmates to see her like that. She decided that she would kick him out, cut all ties, get an order of protection against him, until she found out that she was pregnant. She put off breaking up with him for a while, working doubles just to not go home, basically living at the prison. She only felt safe there, ironically. One day she went home and he was there, sober for once. She told him about the pregnancy. By then she was about 2 months along. He went off saying that he wasn't ready for a child. He demanded that she got rid of it. He gave her money for it the next day before he went to work. Instead of doing that, she spent the money he gave her at the mall. When she got home, he asked her if she had got it done. She said no, explaining that she was 32. She wasn't getting any younger and that she had always wanted a child. She was ready to raise one, with or without him. She says that he glared at her, his eyes full of hatred. If looks could kill, she would have dropped dead right there. He just nodded and said, "Fine, keep it," and stomped off to bed. My mom says that she was surprised. She thought that he would have went off on her. She began to feel hopeful. Maybe he would stop hurting her, stay sober, and they could live happily again. She had dismissed the glare as just her imagination and followed him to bed. She had work early the next day. Sometime during the night, she woke up to find him leaning over her, holding a huge knife to her throat, the same evil look in his eyes from before. "You don't want to do what I tell you, huh? I'll freaking take the baby out of you right now then," he said. They fought, rolling off the bed and crashing to the floor. Somehow she was able to knock the knife out of his hand and it skidded under the bed, out of his reach. She says he then picked her up by her face and threw her against the wall. So she did the only thing she could do and kicked him in the crotch as hard as she could. He let out a yelp and he dropped to his knees. He screamed at her, cupping his balls. My mom says that she quickly grabbed her car keys and ran out of the bedroom. She says her stomach felt like it was on fire, that it hurt so bad and she could barely see. Her head ached from hitting it when she fell off the bed. She got to the living room, wanting to grab her purse before she left. She tried feeling around for it but couldn't find it. My father must have worked through his pain because my mom says that he soon followed her. "You're not leaving," he stated, heading towards the kitchen. My mom says that she felt a shiver run through her body. She knew if she didn't leave right then, she would die that night. She knew that he was going for another knife, and she also knew that she wouldn't make it to the front door, since the kitchen was right next to it. There was no way that she could run to the door before he got to her, not in her condition. She felt like she would pass out at any second. She says as she heard my father rummaging in the kitchen, calling her all types of names. She threw open the living room window, pushed out the screen, and climbed out. She hung from her hands, closed her eyes, began praying, and let herself drop. She fell onto one of the large air conditioning units that you usually see outside, landing on her knees and elbows. She says that it hurt like crazy, but she was alive. Thanking God, she crawled off and limped to the parking lot where the car was. She drove off, never looking back. My mom says that she left her whole life behind, her pretty condo, her friends, a job she loved, and escaped to New York, where my grandmother had lived. All because of my father, a man that she loved and someone she thought loved her back. So Dad, although I haven't seen you since I was like 15, I never want to see you again. As a 15-year-old girl who wasn't the shiniest coin in the jar, I very much craved the attention of guys. I didn't date at all until I went to college, so no guy in my school really showed any interest in me. The ones that I thought might never made a move either. So I had found the Whisper app. On the Whisper app, you can anonymously post your thoughts and feelings where basically anyone around the world can see, as well as people who are only a couple of miles away. In fact, there's a separate tab to look at whispers from your area. You can heart people's posts, reply to them, or direct chat with the person. You can choose what info about yourself is available to be seen when someone decides to direct message you, such as age and gender. I chose not to make that information public. Now, I don't remember what I had posted, but somebody had DM'd me. Their info didn't say much either besides their gender. I was obviously very naive and assumed that it was a guy my age who wanted to talk to me, because the words that he chose and how his messages were written made him seem younger. He asked some questions about me, like how old I was, my interests, and what I did for work, and I answered them. He also asked to see a picture of me, and I sent him one. He told me how beautiful I was and how I was out of his league. He would dodge questions about himself. He would say that he was boring and that he wanted to talk about me. I eventually managed to get him to send a picture of himself, and you guessed it, it was about a mid-40s man. I was surprised that he had sent an honest picture of himself, but at this point I was very understandably freaked out. He then started asking to take me out to dinner, so I kind of stopped talking to him at this point. But he kept trying and saying stuff like, "I'll take you somewhere really nice. I'll throw in a massage." I figured out that you could block people, so that's what I did. And I didn't really think much of it after that. I basically forgot about the conversation after I fell asleep that night. A couple of weeks later, I was at work and it was slammed. The checkout line was starting to wrap around the small store that I worked at. There was only one line but 2 checkout registers at the counter at my work. I had just finished checking out a large order and kinda just looked up to see how bad the line was, and if it seemed like it was going to calm down soon. And that's when I made eye contact with a familiar face, but I couldn't quite place it at first. Then the man smiled and silently mouthed, "Hi there." The image that he sent me in the chat immediately flashed in my mind, and I felt my stomach drop and my heart race. I was terrified and I really didn't want to check this guy out. So I made sure to check people out way slower than I normally do. My coworker checked him out, but I could feel him staring at me the whole time. He even tried to wave me goodbye as he left, and I refused to even slightly turn my head in his direction. As soon as it had calmed down in the store, I went to the bathroom and had a huge panic attack where I nearly threw up. When my mom came to pick me up from work, I very closely watched the side mirror to make sure we weren't being followed by anyone. After that day, I stopped answering DMs if it wasn't somebody who wanted to have an actual conversation about something that I posted. When I was a teenager, my older brother moved out and my parents both worked late, so occasionally I would spend evenings by myself after school. We lived in the countryside a few miles outside of town and had a good collection of neighbors. The day went as normally as ever. I went to school, got home, turned on the TV, had a snack, and texted one of my friends who I had a crush on. It wasn't long afterward that I noticed a man outside my house. He had walked past a few times. He wasn't an ordinary person walking around the block. He looked scraggly and unkempt. I ducked as far as I could behind a chair, still trying to see him out the living room windows, hoping that he didn't see me. But soon he came to the front door and he knocked. I was texting my friend the entire time, increasingly getting freaked out. As he knocked on the door, I stupidly went to answer. I had my phone on me with 911 at the ready. I tried to silently unlock the door and not alert the man, and I opened the door a crack. There was a screen door separating myself and the man, and I was ready to slam the door and lock it if anything happened. The man looked at me with crazed, paranoid eyes. He had a large, dark beard and looked to be in his late 50s or early 60s. He seemed out of breath and his face was drenched with sweat. He was larger too, more the reason to keep my guard. I sheepishly said, "Hello? Please call the police, they're after me," he said in an exhausted smoker voice. He kept looking at the road and tensed whenever a car would occasionally pass. "Who's after you?" I asked, getting ready to slam the door. "I barely escaped. They were right behind me. Please, can I come inside?" At this point, I knew to call the police. "Just wait here, I'll get someone to help." My heart was in my throat at this time. I didn't know if this guy was then going to try to force open the door, so I quickly shut it and locked it. I ran to the back door and locked that as well as I called 911. My heart was racing and I could barely tell the operator my information, but they said that they would send somebody out. It wasn't long until a patrol car arrived, but it felt like forever. The entire time I kept watching the man who then walked into my driveway pacing nervously. The officer got out and proceeded to talk with the man, and they got in the car and they left. I have no idea what happened to him nor if he was telling the truth. He could have been drunk or crazy, but it was a genuine fear in his eyes when I looked at him. Someone truly scared him, and it scared me to think that there could be someone out there that wanted people for whatever reason.